You ever camped alone in an RV before? Let me tell you, it's not the peaceful, relaxing getaway you might think. The idea of parking your RV in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the sounds of nature around you, might sound like a dream, but for some, it turns into a nightmare. This story isn't about wild animals or getting lost in the woods. No. Sometimes what's out there, hiding in the dark, is far worse than any creature you can imagine. It was the summer of 2019 when Jason, a 32-year-old freelance photographer, decided he needed a break from the city. You see, Jason wasn't the type to go on vacations with friends or family. He liked solitude, enjoyed being alone with his thoughts, especially when he was surrounded by nature. So he rented a small RV, packed his gear, and hit the road. His destination, a remote campsite near the mountains, far from any town or city. It was perfect. No noise, no people, just him, his camera, and the wilderness. After driving for hours, he found the spot. It was secluded, peaceful, and exactly what he'd been looking for. Tall pine trees surrounded the clearing where he parked his RV, and a small crystal-clear lake was nearby. As the sun began to set, Jason felt content. He set up his camera to capture the twilight, watching the golden light fade into a deep purple over the mountains. It was one of those moments where everything feels right, but that feeling wouldn't last long. As night fell, Jason settled inside his RV, planning to review the photos he had taken. The silence outside was comforting at first, but then he started hearing noises. At first it was faint, like the rustling of leaves or branches swaying in the wind. But soon it became something more. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling his RV. Jason froze. It's probably just an animal, he thought. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. He ignored it and continued flipping through his photos, but the footsteps grew louder. They were too heavy to be an animal. They sounded human. He grabbed a flashlight and hesitantly opened the RV door, shining the light into the trees. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. No answer. The footsteps stopped. The forest was eerily quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Finally, he convinced himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, and went back inside, locking the door behind him. An hour passed. The sounds had stopped, and Jason began to relax again. But as he was getting ready to sleep, a loud bang echoed through the RV. It was as if someone, or something, had slammed their hand against the side of the vehicle. Jason jumped up, heart racing. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed to the window, but there was no one there. Just darkness. The forest was still. Another bang, this time louder. And it wasn't coming from the side. It was coming from the roof. Jason's mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? Why would someone be messing with him? He had no enemies, no one who even knew he was out here. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone to call for help. But of course, there was no signal. He was completely cut off. The banging continued, each hit harder than the last. Jason grabbed a kitchen knife, his only means of defense, and positioned himself in the center of the RV, trying to stay calm. He kept thinking, what do they want? Why don't they just leave? And then, silence. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started. Jason held his breath, waiting, listening. But all he heard was the blood pounding in his ears. Slowly, cautiously, he moved toward the window and peeked out. Nothing. The forest was calm again, the wind rustling the leaves as if nothing had happened. He waited for what felt like hours, too afraid to sleep, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and Jason drifted off into a restless sleep. In the middle of the night, he woke up with a start. His throat was dry, and he reached for the bottle of water he kept next to his bed. But when his hand touched the bottle, it was warm, not room temperature warm. Warm, like someone had been holding it. Jason's heart sank. He hadn't touched the bottle since before he went to sleep. His eyes darted around the RV. Something was wrong. Then he heard it. A soft whisper, so faint he almost missed it. It was coming from the far corner of the RV, near the door. "Jason," the voice whispered. His blood ran cold. How did they know his name? He scrambled out of bed, gripping the knife tightly. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice cracking. But there was no response, just the sound of his own heavy breathing. He stood frozen in place, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he watched it slowly turn. He lunged forward and locked it just in time, his hand trembling on the handle. Whoever, or whatever, was outside. They were trying to get in. The whispers returned, this time louder, more insistent. "Jason, let us in." The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something wrong about it. It didn't sound human. Jason backed away from the door, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run, to get out. But he was trapped. There was nowhere to go. He was alone in the middle of the wilderness, and no one was coming to save him. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him from all sides. They weren't just coming from outside anymore. They were inside the RV. Jason's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. And then, as quickly as it had started, the voices stopped. Silence filled the air once more. Jason stood in the middle of the RV, knife still in hand, heart racing. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He just waited. But nothing happened. The rest of the night passed without incident. But Jason didn't sleep. As soon as the sun came up, he packed his things and drove out of there, vowing never to camp alone again. Now, some people might say he was just tired, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But Jason swears to this day that something or someone was out there that night. Something that wanted him to open that door. What do you think? Was it just his imagination? Or was there something waiting for him in the dark? Let us know what you think in the comments. And tell us, where are you watching from? Jason thought leaving the campsite would put an end to the nightmare. But the journey back was anything but peaceful. As he drove down the winding forest roads, he kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following him. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind him and the thick trees lining either side. The silence in the RV was almost suffocating. He turned on the radio, hoping for some distraction, but all he got was static. Then, out of nowhere, a voice crackled through the static. It was faint at first, just a murmur under the noise, but as Jason adjusted the dial, it became clearer. A low, raspy whisper, "Jason." He slammed the radio off, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to believe it. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the stress of last night was getting to him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. For hours, he drove without stopping, the tension building with every passing mile. Every shadow on the road looked like a figure. Every sound felt like it was creeping closer. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, even though he was miles from that cursed campsite. By the time he reached the nearest town, it was already evening. Jason pulled into a small gas station, feeling a wave of relief wash over him as he saw other people. It had been nearly 24 hours since he had spoken to anyone. The gas station attendant, An older man with graying hair greeted him with a friendly nod. "Rough trip?" the man asked, noticing the tension on Jason's face. Jason hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Yeah, you could say that." He filled up the RV's tank and decided to grab some food and coffee before continuing. Inside the gas station, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows across the aisles. As Jason walked toward the back of the store, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He quickly grabbed a sandwich and headed to the counter. "You sure you're all right?" the attendant asked again, this time with a concerned look. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jason gave a weak smile. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long couple of days." The man nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered on Jason a bit longer than they should have. As Jason turned to leave, the man called out, "You heading back into the woods?" Jason froze. How did the man know? He hadn't mentioned where he was coming from. "No," Jason replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm heading home, far away from here." The attendant gave him a strange look, then shrugged. "Good idea. Strange things happen out there. People go missing all the time. Best not to be out there alone." Jason didn't respond. He left the gas station quickly, his heart pounding. The man's words echoed in his mind. Strange things happen. People go missing. Why did it feel like a warning? Back in the RV, Jason locked all the doors and windows. He didn't want to take any chances. But as he sat in the driver's seat, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light. But when he looked closer, he saw it. A figure standing by the edge of the gas station, just barely visible under the dim lights. It was too far away to make out any details, but Jason could feel its gaze on him, cold and unblinking. He started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, his hands trembling on the wheel. He didn't look back. For the next few hours, Jason drove in silence, his mind racing. Who or what was that figure? Was it the same thing that had followed him at the campsite? Was he being hunted? By the time Jason reached his apartment in the city, it was well past midnight. The familiar sights and sounds of urban life felt like a distant memory after the isolation of the forest. He parked the RV, grabbed his bags, and rushed inside, locking the door behind him. For the first time in days, he felt safe, or so he thought. That night, as Jason lay in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, he heard it again. The whisper, faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "Jason?" He shot up, heart racing. It was impossible. He was miles away from that campsite, miles away from the woods. But the voice was there, inside his apartment. He looked around, but there was no one there. The apartment was empty, or at least, it should have been. Over the next few days, the whispers grew more frequent. They followed him everywhere, at home, at work, even on the crowded streets of the city. It was always the same. "Jason, let us in." He tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself it wasn't real, but the more he ignored it, the louder it got. One night, as Jason sat in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, he made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. Whatever was haunting him, whatever had followed him from that campsite, he needed to confront it. He needed to end this nightmare. So against his better judgment, Jason packed his bags and drove back to the campsite. It was a long shot, but he had no other options. He had to go back to where it all started. Maybe then he could find some answers. Or maybe he wouldn't come back at all. When he arrived at the campsite, it was exactly as he had left it. The trees stood tall and silent, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the RV was still parked where he had left it. Everything was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Jason stepped out of his car and took a deep breath. "All right," he said aloud, his voice echoing through the trees. "I'm here. What do you want from me?" At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. But then, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. "Jason, let us in." His heart raced as the voices surrounded him, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. He could feel them closing in, could feel their presence all around him. And then, he saw them, figures, shadowy and indistinct, emerging from the darkness. They had no faces, no features, just hollow, empty eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "What do you want?" Jason shouted, his voice trembling with fear. But the figures didn't answer. They just stood there, watching him, waiting. Jason backed away, his mind racing. He had no idea what to do. He had come here for answers, but all he had found was more questions. Suddenly, the figures began to move, slowly advancing toward him. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he realized there was no way out. He was trapped. And then, darkness. Suddenly, Jason woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. He was in his bed, in his apartment. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment, he didn't know if it had all been a nightmare, or if it was still happening. The shadows in the corners of his room seemed to flicker unnaturally, and for a moment he was sure he could hear the faint whispers. "Jason." He sat up, trying to calm himself. He glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. The same time every night when the whispers began. He had to stop this. He had to figure out what was happening before he lost his mind. Over the next few days, Jason became obsessed. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the strange occurrences and the whispers. He researched everything he could about the woods, the campsite, and the paranormal, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what had followed him. But nothing seemed to fit. Whatever was haunting him was beyond anything he had read about or seen in movies. One night, as Jason was going through old internet forums about haunted places, he came across a thread from nearly a decade ago. It was a story posted by someone who claimed to have camped at the same site. The post was short and cryptic, but it mentioned something that sent chills down Jason's spine. "Don't stay in the woods past midnight. They come for you. They follow you." There was no follow-up, no reply from the person who had posted it, but the words echoed in Jason's mind. "They follow you." He knew it wasn't a coincidence. Whoever had posted that knew something about the campsite, something that Jason was now a part of. But the most terrifying part, the post had been the last one that user had ever made. It was as if they had vanished. Jason spent the next few days tracking down everything he could about the person behind the post. It took some effort, but eventually he found an old email address linked to the account. He sent a message, half expecting it to bounce back or be ignored, but to his surprise, he got a reply the next day. The email was short, almost frantic in its tone. "You need to leave. It's not too late. Get rid of everything from that trip. Burn it. Don't let them in. And whatever you do, don't go back to the woods. Once you see them, they never stop." Jason stared at the screen, his blood running cold. Burn everything? He couldn't even bring himself to touch the RV after what had happened. But what if that was the key? What if the RV was somehow a link to the things that were haunting him? That night, Jason made up his mind. He wasn't going to let these things destroy his life. He packed up everything he had from the camping trip, his gear, the maps, even the clothes he had worn, and drove out to a secluded spot outside the city. There, he made a bonfire and threw everything in. As the flames consumed his camping gear, Jason felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe this would be the end of it. Maybe the nightmare would finally be over. But as he stood there, watching the fire, he heard something, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Jason." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but there was no one there. Just the empty night. But the whisper persisted, growing louder. "Jason, let us in." He backed away from the fire, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadows around him seemed to grow longer, darker, like they were alive, creeping toward him. And then he saw them again, the figures, standing at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the trees. Silent. Watching. Jason stumbled back, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? How could he escape them? Suddenly his phone rang, snapping him out of his panic. He looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, low and urgent, came through the line. "Jason, you need to run." "Who is this?" Jason demanded, his voice shaking. "There's no time to explain. They're coming for you. You need to leave, now." Jason's mind raced. Was this some kind of prank? But the fear in the voice on the other end was undeniable. He didn't have time to question it. He turned and ran, leaving the fire and the RV behind. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his lungs burning from the effort. He jumped in, started the engine, and sped off into the night. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The fire was still burning in the distance, but the figures, they were gone. Or at least, they weren't visible anymore. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were still following him, just out of sight, just waiting for the right moment. He drove for hours, not knowing where he was going, just trying to put as much distance between himself and the campsite as possible. By the time he reached a small town, the sun was starting to rise. He pulled into a motel, exhausted, and checked into a room. For the first time in what felt like days, Jason collapsed onto the bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When he woke up, it was late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. Jason sat up, his mind groggy from sleep. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was or why he was there. But then, the memories of the past few days came flooding back, and with them, a sense of dread. He checked his phone. No new messages, no missed calls. It was as if the frantic phone call from last night had never happened. Jason decided to stay in the motel for a few days, hoping the distance from the campsite would give him some peace. But the whispers continued. Every night, like clockwork, they would return, growing louder and more insistent. "Jason, let us in." No matter how far he ran, no matter what he did, they were always there, watching, waiting. It was driving him mad. One evening, Jason sat in the dimly lit motel room, staring at the wall. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to find out what these things wanted. He couldn't keep running forever. That's when he remembered the email. The person who had warned him, who had told him to burn everything and not let them in. Maybe they had more answers. Maybe they knew how to stop this. Jason quickly typed out a message, asking for more information, begging for help. But this time, there was no reply. Hours passed and nothing. Just as he was about to give up, his phone buzzed. It was an email notification. He opened it, his hands shaking. The message was short. "It's too late, Jason. They're already inside." Jason's heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Inside where? And then he heard it. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the motel room. "Jason, let us in." Jason's breath caught in his throat. as he heard the whisper echo from inside the motel room. His eyes darted around the small space, searching for any sign of movement, but everything seemed still. Too still. His heart pounded as he slowly stood up from the bed, his body trembling. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it were right next to him. "Jason, let us in." He backed toward the door, his hands fumbling for the doorknob. His mind raced. How could they be inside? He had locked the door, closed the windows, but that didn't matter anymore. They didn't need doors or windows. They were already here, with him. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. Jason froze, his breath shallow. In the darkness, he could hear them, footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. Panicking, Jason threw the door open and bolted outside, into the cold night air. The parking lot was empty, the distant hum of cars on the highway the only sound. But he knew they were following him. He could feel them, their cold, unnatural presence lurking just behind him. He sprinted to his car, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely get the keys in the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, he floored the gas pedal, tearing out of the motel parking lot and back onto the open road. The whispers, though, they didn't stop. "Jason, let us in." They echoed inside his head, louder, more insistent. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, trying to drown them out. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, the whispers were there, always there. And then, without warning, his car sputtered. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died, leaving him stranded on a desolate stretch of road. Jason slammed his hands against the steering wheel in frustration. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figures standing behind him. But there was nothing. Just the empty road and the darkness pressing in from all sides. Jason stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold night air. He looked around, searching for any sign of help, but the road was deserted. He was completely alone, or so he thought. A soft rustling sound came from the nearby trees. Jason whipped around, his heart racing. The trees stood tall and still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But deep within the woods, he could see something moving. Dark figures, shifting between the trees, coming closer. "Jason, let us in." The voice was louder now, more demanding. Jason stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, to get as far away as possible. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. And then, he saw it. A figure stepped out from the tree line. It was tall, its body unnaturally thin, its face obscured by shadow. But Jason knew deep down that this was one of them, one of the things that had been following him, watching him, waiting for him to slip up. The figure raised its hand, beckoning him closer. "Jason, it's time." Jason's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, trembling. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't keep running. Whatever these things were, they weren't going to stop until they had him. His mind raced, trying to figure out what they wanted. The whispers, the shadows, the figures, they all pointed to one thing. They wanted to be let in. But let in where? To his mind? To his body? He didn't know, and he didn't want to find out. As the figure loomed closer, Jason squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. But then, something strange occurred. The whispers stopped, the air became still, and the figure paused. Jason opened his eyes, confused. The shadowy figure stood frozen in place, as if it were waiting for something. Then from the darkness, another voice emerged, but this one wasn't whispering. It was louder, clearer, and it wasn't coming from the figures. It was coming from inside Jason's head. "Jason, you never should have gone back." Jason gasped, recognizing the voice. It was his own, his thoughts, his memories. They were speaking to him. He realized now what the figures wanted. They were memories, fragments of himself that he had left behind in the woods that night. By going back to the campsite, he had allowed them to latch on to him, to feed on his fear, his guilt, and his unresolved trauma. Jason stood up, his legs shaky but firm. He stared at the figure before him, understanding now what he had to do. "I won't let you in," Jason said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You're not real. You're just a part of me, and I'm done being afraid of you." The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. Then, slowly, it began to fade, dissolving into the darkness from which it had emerged. The whispers quieted, the shadows receded, and the air around Jason grew still once again. He stood there for a long time, alone on the road, breathing in the silence. For the first time in weeks, the constant pressure in his chest lifted. The figures were gone. Jason didn't know what had happened, if it was real or all in his mind, but he didn't care anymore. He had faced his fear, confronted the darkness inside him, and won. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Jason got back in his car. The engine started without a problem this time. He drove off, leaving the motel, the woods, and the haunting whispers far behind him. But as he merged onto the highway, heading back to the city, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time, just to be sure. And that's where our story ends. Or does it? You see, Jason thought he escaped. But what if the whispers never truly go away? What if they're still out there, waiting for the right moment to latch on to someone else? Someone watching this very video right now. But here's the real question for you. What would you do if you were in Jason's shoes? Would you keep running? Or would you confront the shadows? Drop your answers in the comments. I want to know how you would survive. And hey, if this story gave you chills, smash that like button and subscribe, because we've got more terrifying tales just like this coming your way. Don't keep the fear to yourself, though. Share this video with your friends and see how they would handle the whispers. Whether it's on WhatsApp, Messenger, or even by tagging them on social media, make sure they experience the chills too. Remember, the scariest stories are the ones we share. So who will you scare next?